Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Friday, 4 October 2024. It is the 237th anniversary of the birth of François Guizot, who was born in Nîmes, France, on this date in 1787, and who went on to hold many of the highest political offices in France. In my episode on historical exemplars, I talked about how France went through some rough years after the Revolution and Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars. These turbulent times were Guizot's formative years. Guizot came of age in these turbulent times. He lost his father to the Reign of Terror. He was himself a central figure in further turbulent times, and his political career ended because of this political turmoil. He found himself in and out of favor depending on how the political wind shifted, and as a Protestant in France, Guizot was always a bit of an outsider, even as he ascended to the highest political offices. In the light of Guizot's political experiences, we should make a distinction between revolutionary progressivism, according to which progressive change is to be instituted suddenly through a revolution, and reforming progressivism, according to which progressive change is to be instituted through gradual reforms. The French tried revolutionary progressivism in 1789, and they got the Reign of Terror and then Napoleon. Later, with Guizot, they would get reformist progressivism. Guizot, as I said, was a Protestant, and it's typical in history to refer to the Protestant movement as the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation unfolded over more than a century, if we count its beginnings in 1517 with Luther nailing his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, and we count its end as the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648. So that is to say 131 years, and these are years filled with almost unparalleled bloodshed and violence in Europe's history. So where do we draw the line between change, reform, and revolution? The Protestants called for the reform of the church. They didn't call for a revolution of the church. At least at first, they didn't call for revolution. Arguably, the contemporary conception of a political revolution had not yet appeared in history, but the events of the Protestant Reformation would make it possible to conceptualize such a revolution. Once the Pandora's box of the Protestant Reformation had been opened, more radical elements began to appear with the Anabaptists in Germany and the diggers, levelers, and true levelers in England that I mentioned in my episode on Christopher Hill. And these could well be called revolutionary movements. Protestants in France, like Guizot, had a different experience of the Reformation. France was internally divided by wars of religion until the Edict of Nantes granted religious tolerance to Protestants in 1598. Almost 100 years later, Louis XIV, whose son was the unpromising Dauphin, who was the pupil of Bossuet, whom I mentioned in the episode on Bossuet, revoked the Edict of Nantes with the Edict of Fontainebleau in 1685. And again, about 100 years further on, Louis XVI issued the Edict of Versailles in 1787, restoring civil rights to Protestants in the same year that Guizot was born. It could be argued that since the French monarchy, with its deep connections to the ecclesiastical hierarchy of the classic Catholic Church, survived the Protestant Reformation intact, that the Ancien Regime was only buying time, delaying its reckoning with fate, which eventually came due with the French Revolution. The Protestant Reformation was inherently imposed to centralization, and with the concept of the priesthood of all believers, it placed special emphasis on individuality. France, on the other hand, from its inception, was always the most centralized of the monarchies of Europe, and France as a contemporary nation-state is more centralized than most European nation-states. The Huguenot Protestants in France represented the kind of regionalism that the centralization of the French state could not tolerate, even as the state could tolerate Protestants after a fashion. And this accounts for the back and forth over Protestant toleration with the edicts of Nantes, Fontainebleau, and Versailles. But the French did eventually tolerate Protestants to the point that Guizot ascended to the position of prime minister, albeit for less than a year total. For all the conflicting forces at work in France, Guizot offered a compromise. The regime he oversaw was a constitutional monarchy, incorporating limitations on the expansion of the franchise, a ban on political gatherings, and a significant expansion of public education. As is usually the case throughout history, everyone hates a compromise because no one gets everything they want, and Guizot fell from power with the events of 1848, which also involved the fall of many other regimes across Europe. Guizot, we see, was actively involved in the political life of his time, and he lived a long life and wrote voluminously both before and after his political career. He even translated Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire into French, adding more footnotes than in Gibbon's original work. This translation of Gibbon is especially interesting since I think Guizot could rightly be called a philosophical historian, as Gibbon and several of his contemporary historians were called. In my episode on Gibbon, I said that Gibbon looked at history on a civilizational scale. Gibbon's Decline and Fall was a history of a civilization, but Gibbon didn't himself make this claim or frame it in this way. Guizot not only looked at history on a civilizational scale, he looked at history explicitly from the perspective of civilization, and this was something that had not been done previously. In this sense, we could say that Guizot sets the stage for Toynbee 100 years later. Guizot, like Gibbon, but unlike Bossuet, did not attempt a universal history. Instead, Guizot wrote histories that we would call regional or local, but this doesn't really do justice to Guizot's historical project. Guizot wrote an enormous 4-volume work on the history of civilization in France, published in 1830, which we could call a regional history from a civilizational perspective. Before this, Guizot published his General History of Civilization in Europe in 1828. This was the published version of lectures that he had delivered at the Sorbonne, where he was a professor. In his History of French Civilization, he says that his history of European civilization, quote, that course was cursory and of a general nature. I then attempted in a very short period of time to place before you an historical view of European civilization. I hastened, as it were, from point to point, confining myself strictly to general facts and assertions at the risk of being sometimes misunderstood and perhaps discredited, unquote. He explains at the beginning of this work that he could have continued his previous project, his shorter book on the civilization in Europe, as opposed to civilization in France. He could have continued that project by continuing to add detail to it, or he could focus on civilization in one country, and that's what he chose to do with his later large 4-volume History of Civilization in France. But the great value of his General History of Civilization in Europe is that it is a high-level, concentrated summary that takes us through European civilization from the fall of the Roman Empire, where Gibbon had left off, up to the French Revolution. Gibbon wrote his civilizational history in the spirit of the Enlightenment. Guizot comes after the high water mark of the Enlightenment, and his history has a very different feel from that of Gibbon and other Enlightenment historians. Though he is still close enough to the Enlightenment that several Enlightenment themes are prominently present in his history. One might even say that Guizot goes the Enlightenment one better when it comes to the idea of progress. In my episode on Condorcet, I mentioned Guizot in relation to the idea of progress and said that Guizot inherited the intellectual tradition of Turgot and Condorcet, which mirrored what Arthur Lovejoy called the progressivist German philosophies of history of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Guizot takes this progressivist tradition in the philosophy of history and applies it to civilization. In the first lecture of The History of Civilization in Europe, he formulated 4 thought experiments to demonstrate that civilization and progress are coextensive. Guizot asks us to imagine four scenarios, which are permutations of a dialectic between individual progress and social project, each of which is a distinctive lesson on how a people can fall short of being truly civilized. So I'm only going to quote some fragments of a much more detailed exposition that goes on for many pages, but I need to quote just enough to give you a flavor of his four thought experiments in civilization, or a failure of civilization, because these are all four ways in which people fall short of being civilized. So the first one, quote, imagine a people whose outward circumstances are easy and agreeable. Few taxes, few hardships, justice is fairly administered. In a word, physical existence taken together is satisfactory and happily regulated. But with all this, the moral and intellectual energies of this people are studiously kept in a state of torpor and inertness, unquote. In this first thought experiment, life is good, but there is no reason to strive to make life better. The people in such a society are kept benighted as regards their moral and intellectual capacities, which remain undeveloped, even as the people enjoy a reasonably good standard of living. So a good standard of living is not enough for Guizot to raise a people to the level of civilization. His second thought experiment allows for moral and intellectual progress, but it allows for no liberty. Quote, imagine a people whose outward circumstances are less favorable and agreeable, still, however, supportable. As a set-off, its intellectual and moral cravings have not here been entirely neglected. A certain range has been allowed them. Some few pure and elevated sentiments have here been distributed. Religious and moral notions have reached a certain degree of improvement, but the greatest care has been taken to stifle every principle of liberty, unquote. In this thought experiment, life isn't quite as good, but while people have attained some degree of intellectual, moral, and religious progress, they have been allowed no freedom. The lack of freedom is, again, for Guizot, sufficient to deny that a people are civilized. In the next thought experiment, he allows for liberty, but at the expense of social order. Quote, suppose a people among whom there reigns a very large stretch of personal liberty, but among whom also disorder and inequality almost everywhere abound. The weak are oppressed, afflicted, destroyed. Violence is the ruling character of the social condition. Everyone knows that such a state has been the state of Europe. Is this a civilized state? Unquote. In this thought experiment, the people have the freedom that was missing in the first two thought experiments, but it is maybe what Guizot considers too much freedom. Public order has been neglected, and Guizot sees this as a reason enough to be skeptical that he has, in this thought experiment, described a civilized state. Guizot explicitly tells us that this has been the condition of Europe, but he doesn't specify the period during which these conditions obtained in Europe, though he implies that it was in the recent past, perhaps up to his own time. His final thought experiment is more peaceable, but crucially lacks public spiritedness. Quote, a fourth and last hypothesis. Every individual here enjoys the widest extent of liberty. Inequality is rare, or at least of a very slight character. Everyone does as he likes, and scarcely differs in power from his neighbor. But then here scarcely such a thing is known as a general interest. Here exist but few public ideas, hardly any public feeling, but little society. In short, the life and faculties of individuals are put forth and spent in an isolated state, with little regard to society, and with but little regard, and with scarcely a sentiment of its influence. Men here exercise no influence upon one another. They leave no traces of their existence. Generation after generation pass away, leaving society just as they found it, unquote. In this thought experiment, life is good again. And in addition to life being good, people not only enjoy freedom, but also freedom from the oppression of others. But these forms of individual progress are set in a social context in which there is no communal spirit and no social progress. Each generation leaves the world as they found it. And again, for Guizot, this is sufficient to deny a condition of genuine civilization. So for Guizot, the mere absence of the condition of liberty to the point of anarchic violence is not a sufficient condition for civilization. Of these four scenarios, Guizot says, quote, "It is evident that none of the states which I have described will correspond with the common notion of mankind respecting this term. It seems to me that the first idea comprised in the word civilization, and this may be gathered from the various examples which I have placed before you, is the notion of progress, of development. It calls up within us the notion of a people advancing, of a people in a course of improvement and amelioration," unquote. So progress is at the heart of what Guizot calls civilization. And he tells us in these thought experiments that there must be individual liberty, a reasonably good standard of life, intellectual, moral, and religious development, and the development of the society in which these forms of individual progress are exercised. For Guizot, there can be no static, stagnant civilization. Take away intellectual, moral, or social progress, and a society is lacking something essential to civilization. So I have to wonder what judgment Guizot would have given of 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization when the style of art and the way of life was established early and changed very little over time, or even 1,000 years of Byzantine civilization in which only a specialist can tell the difference between two icons painted 500 years apart. Presumably, Guizot would have denied these societies are civilization. What are they then, if they're not civilizations? While Guizot's thought experiments are somewhat systematic, he isn't so systematic that he gives us a taxonomy of societies and says that, these over here are societies are without civilization, and these over here are societies that are civilizations. And we could fault Guizot for not taking this next step, but in fairness, no one else took the next step either. Sociology did eventually produce taxonomies of societies, but not in the context of the study of civilization, which Guizot had made explicit in his history. The problems of progress are well known to us, and many books have been written on them, since the entirety of the 20th century is often adduced as an argument against historical progress. If the 20th century can happen, then what in the world do we mean by progress? The Enlightenment figures from Turgot to Guizot didn't yet question progress in the way that it has been questioned since the events of the 20th century. They were men of the 18th and the 19th centuries. They had a different experience of the world and of civilization. However, they did come to recognize another problem, less familiar, but equally central to society, and that came to be called the stationary state. And this touches on the problem of stagnation. As I said earlier, for Guizot, no stagnant society could be civilized because it's not exhibiting progress. So Guizot touched on the problems of the stationary state by implication in effectively defining civilization in terms of progress. But this leaves us the problem of societies that look like civilization, but which are stagnant, like my examples of Egypt and Byzantium. And of course, I know there are historians who argue that these were not stagnant societies. Just, humor me for a moment and suppose that they were. What do we do? How do we understand apparently stagnant civilizations if, like Guizot, we define civilizations in terms of progress? And progress across the board, you might say, because Guizot wants to see moral, intellectual, and religious progress. And we'll come in a moment to another form of progress that he doesn't explicitly mention, but which we could include in that list. I would argue that the problem of the stationary state comes to a head in the work of John Stuart Mill, who is arguably, again, like Guizot, another continuator of the Enlightenment project, but again, like Guizot, in the 19th century. In his influential book, Principles of Political Economy, which was the textbook on economics for more than a generation in England, Mill wrote of the stationary state, quote, I cannot regard the stationary state of capital and wealth with the unaffected aversion so generally manifested toward it by political economists of the old school. I am inclined to believe that it would be, on the whole, a very considerable improvement on our present condition. I confess I am not charmed with the ideal of life held out by those who think that the normal state of human beings is that of struggling to get on, and the trampling, crushing, elbowing, and treading on each other's heels, which form the existing type of social life, are the most desirable lot of humankind, or anything but the disagreeable symptoms of one of the phases of industrial progress, unquote. That is book 4, chapter 6 of The Stationary State. The whole chapter is about that. From Mill, it seems the offensive features of industrializing society are a temporary maladjustment. And once a society reaches some undefined level of economic maturity, humanity can settle down into a stagnant routine without the trampling, crushing, elbowing, and treading on each other that characterized Mill's time, at least in Mill's eyes. Guizot didn't explicitly formulate a thought experiment to test a society for economic progress, but we could do this in his idiom and find a society lacking in economic progress to fall short of a civilized state, just as a society without liberty, moral, or intellectual progress might be seen to fall short of a civilized state. So this interpretation might be too reductive to be quite true, but again, humor me. We could say that with the century of development from Turgot to John Stuart Mill, we see the transformation of a philosophy of history into a moral presupposition that entails a political program. Mill, for example, had an explicitly formulated political program that he wanted to see enacted. And to a considerably large extent, the reforms Mill wanted to see enacted eventually were enacted in subsequent history. If there's any truth in this interpretation, we would then want to ask whether philosophies of history generally, and not just the Enlightenment philosophy of history of progress, have moral presuppositions that are employed to justify a political program. And of course, this is maybe the oldest complaint about history and philosophy of history. That is to say, that is really about praising or condemning the past rather than about historical understanding. And we want to praise or condemn the past in order to justify or delegitimize the present political order. While contemporary scholarly historians have taken pains to distance themselves from this kind of moralizing history, at least since Ronca, if not before, they can't, it seems, entirely set it aside. The interpretation of 20th century history, and indeed up to our own time today, has been so thoroughly framed in moral terms that we wouldn't even recognize it without this overlay. If you've ever wondered why you so frequently hear appeals to being on the right side of history, that's because this is pure teleology or consequentialism in ethics, or what John Stuart Mill would have called utilitarianism. History, it is implied, when we make this appeal to being on the right side of history, is moving in a particular and definite direction. And when future populations look back on our time and look back on us, you want to be among the few who are retrospectively to be the good people who are in the right, and not among the many who were retrospectively judged to be bad people and in the wrong. Now, I know that's almost a sophomoric oversimplification, but that's what we encounter so often in our society today. For deontologists like Kant, none of this is relevant at all. One of the slogans of deontology is "Justice be done though the heavens may fall." It doesn't matter whether or not history has a direction or what side of the direction of history you're on. It only matters that one does the right thing. Or better yet, the only thing that matters is if you do your duty. Deontology comes from the Greek word dion, which means duty. Kant would add that you must do your duty for duty's sake and not because it's agreeable for you to do your duty, for it to truly be doing your duty and obeying the moral imperative. For the deontologist, if history and duty come into conflict, one must choose duty. You could just as well say, justice be done, though one may end up on the wrong side of history. And this is what I mean by a moral presupposition that entails a political project. Mill took Enlightenment progressivism, handed to him by Guizot, among others, and gave us utilitarianism, and utilitarianism gave us a political program. Guizot, however, didn't do this. Guizot is part of a philosophical lineage that we can now trace from Gibbon and Turgot to Mill and even up to our own contemporary world, with Guizot being one of the figures in the succession. But no one figure in the succession embodies everything that has come of that tradition today. Mill thought we would converge on a stationary state, but as we saw for Guizot, there can be no stagnant civilization. Civilization, to be civilization, must embody progress. We could say for Guizot, progress is an essential property of civilization. But while civilization can't be stagnant, according to Guizot, it does admit of degrees. So we could speculate that Guizot might have allowed stagnant civilizations to be periods of stagnation or of minimal progress within a larger history that includes sporadic progress and which redeems then the historical narrative for progress. And while Guizot made civilization central to his analysis of history, this centrality comes with an important qualification. Quote, civilization, therefore, in its most general idea, is an improved condition of man resulting from the establishment of social order in place of the individual independence and lawlessness of the savage or barbarous life. It may exist in various degrees. It is susceptible of continual progress, and hence the history of civilization is the history of the progress of the human race toward realizing the idea of humanity through the extension and perfection of the social relations, and as affected, advanced, or retarded by the character of the various political and civil institutions which have existed, unquote. This sounds a lot like Turgot and Condorcet, of whom I said earlier that Guizot represents the continuation. And from this vision of history as the realization of humanity, we see that civilization is a means to an end and not an end in itself. We are civilized if we are civilized in order to realize the fulfillment of humanity. That is to say, we are not developing humanity so that we can enjoy the benefits of civilization. We're developing civilization in order to fulfill the full possibilities or fulfill the potential of humanity. This is an interesting idea that might be contrasted to Toynbee, who also came to see civilizations as instrumental in human history and not as ends in themselves. For Toynbee, civilizations were to be the womb in which a universal church came into being, and this would be the institution that would supersede civilization. For Guizot, it is humanity that is brought into the fullness of its existence by civilization, and this we could both compare to and contrast to Kant's view, but I'm going to leave that for another time. So happy birthday, Guizot, and thanks for listening.